What happens when the most feared warrior species in the galaxy discovers that humans don't just fight for survival, they fight for love? When Princess Zarakai of the Veltar Empire first saw the grainy surveillance footage of her arranged marriage partner, she expected to see another weak, submissive species bowing to her people's superior military might. Instead, she watched a human named Marcus Chen laugh while surrounded by her empire's deadliest soldiers, crack jokes during a diplomatic crisis, and somehow make her heart race faster than any battle ever had. The Veltar had conquered 17 star systems by choosing marriage partners from defeated worlds, a tradition meant to humiliate the conquered and display dominance. But they had never encountered humanity before. They had never met a species that could turn a symbol of defeat into a declaration of war, or a man who could make a warrior princess question everything she thought she knew about strength, honor, and what it truly means to fight for something worth having. This is the story of how one arranged marriage became the spark that would either unite two civilizations or burn the galaxy to ash, and how sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the universe is a human who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The detention cell aboard the Veltar flagship Crimson Dominion had held many prisoners over the centuries. Warlords who had wept, diplomats who had begged, and kings who had broken under the weight of inevitable defeat. None of them had ever asked for a deck of cards. Marcuston sat cross-legged on the cold metal floor, shuffling a worn pack with practiced ease while humming an old Earth tune. The fluorescent strips overhead cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, but his green eyes held no trace of fear. At 35, the former Marine had seen enough combat to know that showing weakness was often the fastest way to die. What made this situation unique wasn't the advanced alien technology or the very real possibility of execution, it was the fact that his captors wanted him alive. Human, the synthetic voice crackled through the cell's speaker system. Marcus looked up at the sensor cluster mounted in the corner, still shuffling cards. You will prepare yourself for presentation to Her Imperial Highness, Princess Zarakai. Presentation? Marcus chuckled, dealing himself a hand of solitaire on the floor. That's a fancy word for walking to your death, isn't it? He placed a red 7 on a black 8. Tell you what, I'll need about 10 more minutes to finish this game. Think the princess can wait? The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the distant thrum of the ship's engines. He'd been aboard the massive vessel for 3 days now, ever since the Veltar fleet had appeared over Earth's moon with an ultimatum that had made every world leader break into a cold sweat. The message had been simple: surrender one representative for marriage to Princess Zarakai, or watch humanity's home world burn. Earth's governments had debated for exactly 6 hours before the volunteers started stepping forward. Marcus hadn't volunteered, he'd been voluntold by a panicked UN Security Council that needed someone expendable. A man with no family, no political connections, and a military record that made him useful enough to survive the initial meeting but not important enough to create a diplomatic incident if things went wrong. The cell door hissed open, revealing 4 Veltar soldiers in their characteristic crimson armor. Each stood nearly 8 feet tall, their elongated limbs and angular features giving them an insectoid appearance that had terrified Earth's first contact teams. Their leader, identifiable by the silver markings on her chest plate, gestured with a weapon that resembled a crystalline tuning fork. Rise, human. You will not keep the princess waiting. Marcus finished placing his cards, then stood with an easy grace that seemed to catch the soldiers off guard. Lead the way, folks. Just promise me the wedding reception won't be too formal. I forgot to pack my good shoes. The corridor beyond stretched for what felt like miles, lined with trophy cases containing artifacts from conquered worlds. Marcus recognized Centauran crystal sculptures, Andromedan metal-weave tapestries, and what looked like ceremonial weapons from dozens of different species. Each case bore a small plaque with dates and casualty figures that painted a clear picture of the Veltar Empire's expansion. Impressive collection, Marcus commented, nodding toward a case containing what appeared to be a crown made of living flame. Let me guess, wedding gifts from previous arranged marriages? The lead soldier's helmet turned slightly in his direction. Tributes from defeated civilizations. The princess's previous unions have brought great wealth to the empire. Previous unions? Marcus stopped walking, causing the soldiers behind him to tense. How many times has this lady been married? Princess Zarakai has honored 17 species with her matrimonial presence, the soldier replied with obvious pride. Each union has resulted in the peaceful integration of their homeworlds into the empire. Marcus resumed walking, but his mind was racing. 17 marriages to representatives of conquered worlds, it was a brilliant strategy. Force each defeated civilization to symbolically submit by offering their best as a sacrifice to Veltar's superiority. The marriages probably lasted just long enough for the propaganda value to sink in before the unfortunate grooms met with unfortunate accidents. The corridor ended at massive double doors that seemed to be carved from a single piece of black stone. Veltar hieroglyphs covered every inch of the surface, telling what Marcus assumed was the story of their empire's glorious conquests. The soldiers formed up around him as the doors began to open with surprising silence. The throne room beyond defied every expectation Marcus had formed during his brief captivity. Instead of the stark military aesthetic he'd seen throughout the ship, this chamber was a masterpiece of alien artistry. Curved walls rose to impossible heights, covered in murals that seemed to move in the shifting light. Gardens of crystalline plants lined pathways between pools of water that glowed with bioluminescent microorganisms. At the far end of the room, on a throne that appeared to be grown rather than built, sat Princess Zarakai. Marcus had seen the intelligence photos, of course. Earth's deep space telescopes had captured images of Veltar dignitaries during their expansion campaigns, and the princess had appeared in several of them. But those grainy, long-distance shots hadn't prepared him for the reality of seeing her in person. She was tall, even by Veltar standards, with the same elongated proportions as her soldiers but none of their harsh angularity. Her skin held a slight blue tint that seemed to shift in the chamber's strange lighting, and her features combined alien geometry with something that could almost be called beautiful. Her hair, if the flowing silver strands could be called hair, moved as though underwater, defying the chamber's apparent lack of wind. But it was her eyes that caught Marcus's attention. Large and completely black, they reflected the chamber's bioluminescent glow like polished obsidian. Those eyes were studying him with an intensity that made him wonder if she could read his thoughts. "Approach, human," her voice carried clearly across the vast chamber, melodic despite the underlying harmonics that suggested vocal cords designed for different frequencies than those used by any Earth species. Marcus walked forward with the same easy confidence he'd shown in the cell, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. The soldiers remained at the entrance, apparently confident that their princess could handle one unarmed human. When he reached the base of the throne's organic steps, he stopped and looked up at her with frank curiosity. "Your Imperial Highness," he said with a slight nod. "I'm Marcus Chen. I understand congratulations are in order." Princess Zarakai tilted her head slightly, a gesture that seemed distinctly non-human despite its familiarity. "Congratulations? On our engagement." Marcus's smile was genuine, if somewhat rueful. "Though I have to admit, this is the first time I've proposed to someone by having my entire species threatened with extinction. Usually I start with dinner and a movie." The princess leaned forward slightly, her black eyes narrowing. "You find humor in your situation, human?" "Marcus," he corrected gently. "And, yeah, I find humor in most situations. It's either laugh or cry, and crying gives me a headache." He gestured toward the magnificent chamber around them. "Besides, if I'm going to die, at least I'll do it somewhere with a good view." For a long moment, Princess Zarakai said nothing. Her guards remained motionless, but Marcus could sense a tension in the chamber that hadn't been there moments before. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of something that might have been confusion. "You believe you are going to die? Aren't I?" Marcus met her gaze steadily. "Let me guess how this works. We have some kind of ceremony, I get paraded around as proof that humanity has submitted to the glorious Veltar Empire, and then, I have a tragic accident that leaves you a widow and free to marry the representative of your next conquest." The princess rose from her throne with a fluid grace that made Marcus think of water flowing uphill. She was even taller than he'd estimated, at least 7 feet, putting her almost a full foot above his own considerable height. But, as she descended the steps toward him, Marcus noticed something else: she was nervous. Her movements were too controlled, too precise, like someone trying hard not to reveal their true feelings. The marriages of imperial succession are sacred bonds, she said, stopping within arm's reach of him. This close, Marcus could see that her skin wasn't entirely blue, intricate patterns of silver traced across her features like delicate tattoos. Previous consorts have lived honored lives as members of the imperial family. Aha! Marcus's tone suggested polite skepticism. And how many of these honored family members are still alive? Princess Zarakai's black eyes flickered, a brief break in her composure that told Marcus everything he needed to know. The consorts of imperial marriage serve the empire until death claims them naturally. Naturally, Marcus repeated. Right. He clasped his hands behind his back again and began to walk slowly around the base of the throne, studying the murals on the nearby walls. The princess turned to track his movement, but made no move to stop him. These paintings tell the story of your conquests? The expansion of the empire, yes. Her voice carried a note of pride. Each victory is recorded for future generations to study. Marcus paused in front of a particularly detailed mural showing Veltar forces overwhelming what looked like a human city. The artwork was beautiful in its alien way, but the subject matter was unmistakably violent. Civilians fled in terror while soldiers in crimson armor advanced with weapons raised. This one's recent, he observed. The preliminary assault on your colony world of Kepler 442b, Princess Zarakai confirmed. Your species fought bravely, but brief resistance cannot overcome superior technology and tactics. Marcus continued his circuit around the throne. You know, Princess, I've been in a lot of fights in my life. Military campaigns, police actions, the occasional bar brawl when I was younger. He stopped directly in front of her. And I've learned that the side that's truly winning doesn't usually need to resort to kidnapping civilians for propaganda marriages. The chamber fell silent except for the distant sound of water moving through the crystalline gardens. Princess Zarakai's black eyes reflected Marcus's image like dark mirrors, and, for a moment he thought he saw something almost like surprise in their depths. You question the empire's strength? I question what kind of empire needs to humiliate defeated enemies instead of just ruling them, Marcus replied. A marriage based on conquest isn't a symbol of strength, it's a symbol of insecurity. The sound of weapons powering up echoed from the chamber's entrance. The guards had apparently heard enough. But Princess Zarakai raised one hand without looking away from Marcus, and the deadly humming faded back to silence. Explain, she said simply. Marcus glanced around the magnificent chamber, then, back at the alien princess who held his life in her hands. On Earth, we have a saying, the lion doesn't concern himself with the opinion of sheep. If the Veltar Empire is as powerful as you claim, why do you need these marriage ceremonies? Why not just conquer worlds and move on? The marriages ensure peaceful integration, the marriages ensure submission, Marcus interrupted. There's a difference. You're not just conquering territory, you're conquering spirits. Breaking the will of entire civilizations by forcing them to watch their representatives submit to your royal family. He smiled, but there was no humor in it now. The thing is, Princess, that strategy only works if your marriage partners actually submit. Princess Zarakai took a step closer to him. Her alien features were unreadable, but Marcus could sense the intensity of her focus. And you will not submit? Well, that depends. Marcus's smile returned, genuine and slightly reckless. Are you planning to actually marry me, or just use me as a prop in your empire's propaganda campaign? The princess stopped, her composed facade cracking slightly. For the first time since entering the chamber, she looked uncertain. The imperial marriages are sacred bonds. That's not an answer. Marcus crossed his arms. Let me ask you something, Your Highness. Of those 17 previous husbands, how many did you actually get to know? How many did you have real conversations with? How many did you? Enough. Princess Zarakai's voice carried harmonics that made the crystalline plants in the nearby gardens ring like chimes. You forget your position, human. Marcus, he corrected again. And I haven't forgotten anything. I know exactly what my position is. He gestured toward the murals surrounding them. I'm number 18 in your collection of conquered species. The question is whether you want another trophy husband or something more interesting. The princess stared at him for a long moment, her black eyes reflecting the chamber's shifting lights. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost uncertain. What do you mean by something more interesting? Marcus felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. For the first time since his capture, he sensed an opportunity not just for survival, but for something that could change the entire dynamic between their species. I mean, maybe it's time someone in this empire learned what humans are really like when we're fighting for something we actually believe in, he said. Because, princess, if you really want to understand my species, you're going about it completely wrong. The silence that followed stretched until Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Then, Princess Zarakai did something that no intelligence briefing had prepared him for. She laughed. It was a musical sound, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, but unmistakably genuine. The guards at the chamber entrance shifted nervously, apparently as surprised as Marcus by their princess's reaction. You are either very brave or very foolish, Marcus Chen, she said, and, hearing his name in her alien voice sent an unexpected shiver down his spine. Probably both, he admitted. But that's what makes us human. Princess Zarakai tilted her head in that distinctly non-human gesture again. Very well, human Marcus. You wish to show me what your species is truly like? Then, you shall have that opportunity. She turned and began walking back toward her throne. The imperial marriage ceremony will take place in 7 days. You will use that time to demonstrate these qualities you claim make humanity worthy of something more than simple conquest. And, if I succeed? The princess paused at the base of her throne and looked back at him over her shoulder. Then, perhaps this marriage will be more than a symbol of submission. Her black eyes seemed to gleam with something that might have been anticipation. But, Marcus Chen, if you fail to impress me in these 7 days, you will discover exactly how natural the deaths of my previous consorts truly were. As the guards moved forward to escort him back to his quarters, Marcus found himself grinning despite the very real threat he'd just received. For the first time since his capture, he had something to work with. 7 days to change the mind of an alien princess who might just be the key to saving both their civilizations. The game, as they say, was on. Marcus's new quarters were a significant upgrade from the detention cell, though calling them quarters was like calling the Grand Canyon a ditch. The space was larger than most Earth apartments, with curved walls that seemed to be carved from the same black stone as the throne room doors. Bioluminescent panels provided soft lighting that shifted subtly throughout what he assumed were the ship's day and night cycles. What struck him most wasn't the alien luxury, it was the complete absence of any entertainment, communication devices, or even books. The Veltar apparently expected their guests to spend their time in contemplation or meditation. Marcus spent his first hour exploring the space, finding a bedroom with a bed that adjusted itself to his body weight, a bathroom with facilities that required some creative problem-solving to figure out, and a sitting area with furniture that seemed to flow out of the floor itself. He was examining what appeared to be a window showing the starfield beyond the ship when the door chimed. 3 figures entered, 2 guards and a third Veltar who was clearly not military. This one wore robes instead of armor, and her movements had a different quality, more scholarly than martial. I am Scholar Prime Cathera, she said in accented but clear English. I have been assigned as your cultural liaison. Marcus turned from the window. Cultural liaison? That's fancy talk for babysitter, isn't it? Cathera's head tilted in what Marcus was beginning to recognize as a Veltar expression of curiosity. I do not understand this term babysitter. Someone who watches children to make sure they don't get into trouble. Marcus gestured toward the guards. Though I'm guessing your version comes with more deadly weapons. Ah. Something that might have been amusement crossed Cathera's alien features. An apt comparison. Though my role is also to help you understand our customs and to answer questions about the coming ceremony. And to report back to the princess about everything I say and do? That as well, Cathera admitted without apparent embarrassment. Shall we begin with your questions about the imperial marriage rites? Marcus settled into one of the flowing chairs, which adjusted itself to his height with unsettling efficiency. Actually, I'd rather start with some questions about the empire itself. Help me understand what I'm getting myself into. Very well. Cathara dismissed the guards with a gesture and took a chair across from him. What would you know? Let's start with the princess. Tell me about her, not the official biography, but what she's actually like. Cathara was quiet for a moment, her large black eyes studying Marcus with an intensity that made him wonder if she was trying to determine his motives. Princess Zarakai is complex. She was raised from hatching to rule, trained in warfare and statecraft from the earliest age. She has never known defeat in battle or politics. Until now? The Empire has not been defeated, but it's not winning as easily as it used to, Marcus interrupted. Otherwise you wouldn't need propaganda marriages to keep conquered populations in line. What's changed? Cathara's silence stretched long enough that Marcus thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried undertones he couldn't identify. The Empire expanded rapidly in its early centuries because we encountered species that submitted readily to superior force. But, in recent decades, we have faced civilizations that... She paused, apparently searching for words. That do not break as expected. Civilizations like humanity? Yes. And others. The Caraxian Syndicate fought for 18 years before accepting imperial rule. The Threnodai required orbital bombardment of 3 worlds before surrendering. Each conquest has become more costly. Marcus leaned forward. And the princess knows this? Princess Zarakai commanded the assault fleets in 7 of the last 10 expansions. She has seen the changing nature of our conflicts firsthand. Cathara's black eyes reflected the room's shifting light. It troubles her, though she would never admit such concerns to the Imperial Council. The Imperial Council? The ruling body that advises the Emperor, her father. They believe that increased resistance from conquered species is temporary, that traditional methods will eventually prove successful. Cathara's voice carried a note that Marcus couldn't quite identify. The princess has different theories. Such as? Perhaps you should ask her yourself. She has requested your presence at the evening meal. Marcus blinked. She wants to have dinner with me? The request was most unusual, Cathara admitted. Imperial protocol does not typically include personal meetings between the princess and her future consorts beyond the formal ceremonies. But she's making an exception. It would seem so. Though I must warn you, do not mistake her interest for weakness. Princess Zarakai has killed more sentient beings in personal combat than most warrior castes manage in entire lifetimes. Marcus stood and moved back to the window, watching the stars while slowly past as the massive ship continued its journey to wherever they were headed. Cathara, can I ask you something? And I want an honest answer. I will attempt honesty within the bounds of my loyalty to the Empire. Fair enough. Marcus turned back to face her. Do you think this arrangement, the marriage, the propaganda, the whole system is working? Cathara's features went very still. That question borders on sedition, human Marcus. Marcus. Just Marcus. And, I'm not asking you to commit sedition, I'm asking for your professional opinion as someone who studies cultures for a living. Marcus returned to his chair. You've watched 17 of these marriages. You've seen how the conquered species react. In your scholarly opinion, is the system achieving its goals? The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the distant thrum of the ship's engines through the walls. Cathara sat motionless, her alien features unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. The early marriages were effective. The conquered species accepted their integration into the Empire with minimal resistance after witnessing the ceremonial submission of their representatives. But, in recent years... She paused, glancing toward the door as if checking for eavesdroppers. The marriages have had the opposite effect. Instead of encouraging submission, they have inspired resistance movements. Several recently conquered worlds have experienced uprisings that began with protests against the imperial marriage ceremonies. Marcus felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. And the princess knows this? She has asked me to compile detailed reports on post-marriage compliance rates. she reviews them personally. Kathera's black eyes met his. The trend is concerning. But she can't openly question the system without challenging the Imperial Council and her father. The princess is heir to the empire. Her position requires absolute loyalty to established traditions. But Kathera's tone suggested volumes left unsaid. A soft chime indicated someone at the door. Kathera rose quickly, her scholarly composure returning. That will be your escort to the evening meal. Remember, human Marcus, the princess may seem interested in conversation, but she is first and always a weapon of the Empire. As the Scholar Prime left, replaced by two different guards, Marcus found himself wondering which was more dangerous, facing a warrior princess who wanted to kill him, or facing one who might actually listen to what he had to say. The dining chamber was smaller than the throne room but no less impressive. Curved walls displayed what appeared to be real-time images from various worlds throughout the Empire, conquered civilizations going about their daily lives under Veltar rule. The table itself was a work of art, seemingly carved from a single piece of translucent crystal that glowed with its own inner light. Princess Zarakai was already seated when Marcus arrived, but she rose as he entered, a gesture that clearly surprised his escort guards. She had changed from her formal robes into something that could almost be called casual wear, though the flowing garments still managed to suggest regal authority. "Marcus," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her. "Please, be seated." Marcus noticed that she used his first name without the formal titles from their earlier meeting. He also noticed that they were alone except for the guards, who had positioned themselves at the chamber's entrance, close enough to respond to threats, far enough away to avoid overhearing quiet conversation. "Your Highness," Marcus said, settling into the crystal chair. "Thank you for the invitation. Though I have to warn you, I'm not sure what Veltar fine dining involves, and Earth's diplomatic protocols never covered interspecies dinner etiquette. The meal will be adapted to your biological requirements," the princess assured him. "I am more interested in conversation than ceremony." Food began appearing on the table, not carried by servants, but seeming to rise from the crystal surface itself. Marcus recognized some of the items as vegetable analogues, while others were completely alien. Everything was beautifully presented and smelled surprisingly appetizing. "This is incredible," Marcus said, sampling something that tasted like a cross between chicken and hazelnuts. "How does the table?" "Never mind. I'm guessing the answer involves technology that would take me 6 months to understand." Princess Zarakai's black eyes reflected the table's inner light as what might have been amusement crossed her features. "You adapt quickly to new situations. It's a survival skill. Though I have to ask, is this how you normally dine with your marriage partners?" "I have never dined with a consort before the ceremony." She sampled her own food with movements that were economical and precise. "In fact, I have rarely spoken with them at length beyond the ritual exchanges." Marcus paused, a forkful of alien vegetables halfway to his mouth. "Why am I different?" Princess Zarakai set down her eating utensil and studied him across the crystal table. "Because you are the first who has spoken to me as if I were a person rather than a symbol." The admission hung in the air between them, and Marcus realized he was seeing something no intelligence briefing had prepared him for: vulnerability. "Your previous marriage partners treated you like a symbol?" "They treated me like a force of nature. Something to be feared, appeased, or endured, but never truly engaged with." She gestured toward the walls displaying scenes from across the Empire. "I have been Emperor's daughter, fleet commander, princess of the Empire, but rarely simply myself." Marcus set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "What's yourself like?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She tilted her head in that distinctly alien gesture, her silver hair moving like water around her shoulders. "I am not certain I understand. Away from the throne room, away from the formal ceremonies, away from being the princess of the Empire, what is Zarakai like?" She was quiet for a long time, her black eyes studying the food on her plate. When she looked up again, Marcus saw something he hadn't expected: uncertainty. "I do not know. I have never been permitted to discover that." The honesty in her voice hit Marcus harder than he'd anticipated. Here was someone who had conquered star systems but had never been allowed to simply be herself. Well, he said gently, maybe that's something we could explore over the next few days. You would use your time attempting to understand me rather than planning an escape or pleading for your life? Marcus smiled. Princess Zarakai, I stopped trying to escape impossible situations a long time ago. I learned it's usually more effective to change them from the inside. He gestured toward the images on the walls. Besides, I have a feeling that understanding you might be the key to understanding this whole empire. Princess Zarakai followed his gaze to the wall displays, her expression growing thoughtful. What do you see when you look at those images? Marcus studied the scenes: Veltar administrators overseeing construction projects, conquered populations going about their daily lives, children playing in the shadows of imperial monuments. I see civilizations that have been conquered but not converted. People living under your rule, but not truly part of your empire. Explain. On Earth, we have a saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can force populations to submit, but you can't force them to truly accept your authority. Marcus pointed to one of the displays showing what appeared to be a market scene. Look at the body language of those people. They're going through the motions of daily life, but they're not engaged with your administrators. They're enduring imperial rule, not embracing it. Princess Zarakai leaned forward, her attention focused entirely on Marcus. And the marriage ceremonies? They're making the problem worse. Every time you force a conquered species to watch their representative submit to your royal family, you're not demonstrating strength, you're creating a symbol of resistance. Marcus met her black gaze steadily. You're giving them something to rally around. The Imperial Council believes the Imperial Council is wrong. Marcus's voice was quiet but firm. And I think part of you knows that, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. Princess Zarakai was silent for several minutes, her alien features unreadable. The food grew cold on their plates as she studied the wall displays with new intensity. When she finally spoke, her voice carried undertones Marcus couldn't identify. What would you suggest instead? It was the question Marcus had been hoping for since their first meeting. Partnership instead of conquest. Integration instead of submission. He gestured toward the displays. These civilizations have knowledge, technologies, cultural innovations that could benefit the empire if they were treated as allies rather than subjects. The empire's expansion has always been based on military superiority, and that worked fine when you were facing species that folded quickly under pressure. But you're not anymore, are you? Marcus leaned forward. How many resources are you spending on suppressing rebellions? How many fleets are tied down maintaining order instead of exploring new territories? Princess Zarakai's black eyes seemed to look right through him. Scholar Prime Cathara has been investigating those exact questions. And what has she found? That suppression costs are increasing exponentially while expansion benefits are declining. The princess's voice carried a note of frustration that seemed very human despite her alien features. But the Imperial Council interprets this as evidence that we need more forceful methods, not different ones. Marcus felt a spark of hope. What do you interpret it as? I interpret it as evidence that we may have reached the limits of what pure military force can achieve. Princess Zarakai rose from her chair and moved to stand before one of the wall displays. But I am one voice among many, and not the loudest. Marcus joined her at the display, which showed a crowd gathered in what appeared to be a public square on one of the conquered worlds. The people weren't rioting or protesting, they were simply standing together, their unified presence a quiet statement of resistance. You could be the loudest voice, Marcus said quietly. You're the heir to the empire. Your opinion carries weight. My opinion carries weight only as long as it aligns with established policy. If I openly question the foundations of imperial expansion. She trailed off, but Marcus could finish the thought. You'd be challenging your father's entire legacy. And the economic interests of every noble family that has profited from conquest. Princess Zarakai turned back to face him. Change in the empire is not simply a matter of changing minds, Marcus. It is a matter of changing an entire civilization. Marcus nodded slowly. But it starts with changing one mind at a time. He met her gaze. The question is whether you're willing to be the first. Princess Zarakai studied him for a long moment, her black eyes reflecting the chamber's shifting lights. You would risk your life on the possibility that I might be willing to consider change? Princess, I risked my life the moment I agreed to this marriage. The difference is whether I risk it for nothing or for the chance to actually make a difference. She was quiet for so long that Marcus began to wonder if he'd pushed too hard. But, when she spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that sounded almost like wonder. In all my years, no one has ever suggested that I could choose to be something other than what I was raised to be. Everyone has choices, Zarakai. Even princesses of galactic empires. Marcus smiled. The question is what kind of princess you want to be, one who inherits a legacy of conquest, or one who creates a legacy of something entirely new. Princess Zarakai moved back to the crystal table, her movements thoughtful and deliberate. You would help me explore these possibilities? If you want me to. Though I should warn you, humans have a tendency to ask uncomfortable questions and suggest impossible ideas. Perhaps, she said, settling back into her chair, that is exactly what the Empire needs. As they returned to their meal, Marcus found himself looking at the wall displays with new eyes. Instead of seeing conquered populations enduring imperial rule, he began to see potential allies waiting for someone to offer them a better alternative. The next 6 days were going to be very interesting indeed. The next 3 days fell into a pattern that neither Marcus nor Princess Zarakai had expected. Each morning, Scholar Prime Kethera would arrive with reports and data about various aspects of the Empire: population statistics, resource allocation, military deployment figures, cultural assessments of conquered worlds. Each afternoon, Marcus would study these reports in his quarters, making notes and asking questions that clearly made Kethera uncomfortable. And, each evening, he would dine with the princess and share his observations. The Andromedan Confederacy, Marcus said on the second evening, gesturing toward a holographic display that showed resource flowcharts. They were conquered 8 years ago, but they're still operating their own manufacturing systems independently of imperial oversight. Princess Zarakai nodded, sampling something that looked like crystallized fruit. The Andromedans possess advanced nanofabrication technology that our engineers have been unable to replicate. We found it more efficient to allow them to continue production under imperial supervision. But, they're not really under imperial supervision, are they? Marcus pointed to specific data points on the display. Look at these efficiency ratings. Andromedan production has actually increased since the conquest, but the percentage going to imperial stockpiles has been declining steadily. The princess paused, her black eyes focusing on the data Marcus had highlighted. That should not be possible. The terms of their integration specify exact quotas which they're meeting. But they're producing far more than the quotas require, and the excess is staying in Andromedan space. Marcus leaned back in his chair. They're not cheating you, Zarakai. They're just being smarter than your administrators expected. Explain. Marcus activated another section of the display, showing trade route mappings. The Andromedans are using their increased production capacity to establish trade relationships with other conquered worlds. They're creating an economic network that operates parallel to the imperial system, technically legal, but completely independent. Princess Zarakai set down her eating utensil and studied the display with new intensity. Show me the other worlds. For the next hour, Marcus walked her through the data, pointing out patterns that painted a clear picture. The Centauran crystal miners were trading directly with Caraxian metalworkers. The Threnodai agricultural collectives were supplying food to mining operations on 6 different worlds. Conquered civilizations were building an economic web that functioned without imperial oversight or control. This network, Princess Zarakai said finally, it spans 17 different conquered systems. 18 if you count the preliminary trade agreements they've apparently made with Earth corporations. Marcus pulled up another data set. Your intelligence services classify this as normal post-conquest economic activity, but it's actually something much more sophisticated. What? They're building a shadow empire within your empire. Not a rebellion, something much more dangerous to your current system. Marcus met her gaze across the crystal table. They're proving that they don't need you. The silence that followed was profound. Princess Zarakai stared at the holographic displays, her alien features cycling through expressions that Marcus was beginning to recognize as deep thought. When she finally spoke, her voice carried undertones of what might have been admiration. This is why resistance to imperial expansion is increasing. Partially. But it's also why you have an opportunity. Marcus gestured toward the economic data. These civilizations aren't trying to destroy the empire, they're trying to evolve beyond it. If you could find a way to formalize these relationships, to turn this shadow network into an official part of imperial policy, we would transform conquest into genuine integration. Princess Zarakai's black eyes gleamed with something that looked like excitement. Instead of subjugating these worlds, we could partner with them. Exactly. The Empire gets access to their innovations and resources, they get protection and access to imperial infrastructure, and everybody benefits more than they do under the current system. Princess Zarakai rose from her chair and began pacing around the crystal table, her movements quick and decisive. The economic benefits alone would be substantial. If we could eliminate the costs of maintaining control through force, you could redirect those resources toward exploration, research, actual expansion instead of just suppression. Marcus watched her pace, noting the energy in her movements. But there would be political costs. She stopped pacing and looked at him. The Imperial Council. And every noble family whose wealth depends on maintaining the current system of conquest and tribute. Marcus stood as well, moving to stand beside the holographic displays. This kind of change would threaten a lot of powerful interests. Yes, Princess Zarakai said simply. It would. Are you willing to take on that kind of opposition? She was quiet for a long moment, her black eyes studying the economic data floating between them. 3 days ago, I would have said no. The risk would be too great, the potential for failure too high. And now? Now I find myself wondering what kind of empire I want to inherit. She moved closer to the displays, her fingers tracing patterns in the holographic data. For my entire life, I have been trained to see conquest as the only path to strength. But this data suggests that partnership might be a path to something greater than strength. What's greater than strength? Princess Zarakai turned to face him, and Marcus saw something in her alien features that he hadn't expected to see: hope. Sustainability. Growth that doesn't require constant warfare. An empire that expands through innovation rather than destruction. That's a beautiful vision, Zarakai. But visions are easy. Implementation is hard. Yes, she agreed. And it would require allies. People willing to help navigate the political complexities of changing an entire civilization's approach to expansion. Marcus felt his heart rate increase slightly. Are you asking what I think you're asking? I am asking if you would be willing to be more than a symbol of conquest. Princess Zarakai moved closer to him, close enough that he could see the silver patterns that traced across her blue-tinted skin. I am asking if you would be willing to be a partner in creating something new. The weight of the moment settled on Marcus like gravity from a heavier world. Everything he'd hoped for since his capture was being offered to him, not just survival, but the chance to actually change the relationship between their civilizations. But accepting would mean committing to something far more dangerous than any military campaign. Zarakai, he said carefully, what you're talking about isn't just political reform. It's revolution. Yes. It could destabilize the entire empire. It could start a civil war between the old guard and the reformers. It could save both our civilizations from a conflict that will otherwise destroy millions of lives. Her black eyes held his gaze steadily. Or it could fail spectacularly and result in both our deaths. Marcus looked at the holographic displays around them, showing the intricate web of relationships that conquered civilizations had built despite imperial attempts to control them. These people hadn't given up, they'd found a way to thrive even under conquest. If they could show that kind of resilience, maybe he could show a little courage. All right, he said. I'm in. But I have conditions. Princess Zarakai tilted her head in that distinctly alien gesture. Such as? First, this has to be a real partnership. Not you making decisions and me rubber stamping them, but genuine collaboration. Marcus held up a finger. Second, we involve representatives from the conquered worlds in planning this. They've already proven they're more creative than your administrators expected, we need their input. Agreed. And, third? Marcus smiled. Third, we find a way to make this marriage ceremony actually mean something instead of just being political theater. Princess Zarakai's features went very still. You wish the marriage to be genuine? I wish the marriage to be whatever we decide it should be. Marcus moved closer to her, noting that even with her superior height, they could still look each other in the eye. If we're going to change how the Empire thinks about relationships between civilizations, maybe we should start by changing how we think about the relationship between us. Princess Zarakai paused, and, for the first time since Marcus had met her, she seemed genuinely uncertain. I have never considered marriage as anything other than a political alliance. Neither have I, to be honest. Most humans get married for love, but this situation is a bit outside normal parameters. Marcus smiled. The thing is, Zarakai, I've spent the last 3 days getting to know you, and I like what I've learned. You're intelligent, you're willing to question assumptions, and you genuinely care about finding better ways to do things. That's a pretty good foundation for any kind of partnership. Even a marriage? Especially a marriage. At least if we're going to be working together to revolutionize an interstellar empire, we might as well enjoy each other's company. Princess Zarakai was quiet for a long time, her black eyes reflecting the light from the holographic displays. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an uncertainty that somehow made her seem more real than all her royal authority. I do not know how to be a wife, Marcus. I know how to be a warrior, a commander, a princess. But, the other. She gestured helplessly. I have no experience with such things. Neither do I, Marcus admitted. I've never been married to an alien princess planning to overthrow the political foundations of a galactic empire. But, maybe that's okay. Maybe we can figure it out as we go. You would accept such uncertainty? Marcus looked around the crystal chamber with its displays showing the vast complexity of the empire they were proposing to change. Zarakai, uncertainty is pretty much all we have right now. The question is whether we face it separately or together. Princess Zarakai moved to stand directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the subtle way her silver hair moved as though responding to its own wind. Together, then, she said, and extended her hand toward him in what he recognized as a human gesture. Marcus took her hand, noting that her skin was warm despite its alien appearance and that her fingers were longer than human proportions but oddly graceful. Together, he agreed. As they stood there in the crystal chamber, surrounded by data about the empire they planned to transform, Marcus realized that somewhere in the last 3 days his priorities had shifted. He'd started this conversation hoping to survive long enough to save his species from conquest. Now he found himself hoping to save an entire galaxy from a war that nobody really wanted. And, maybe, just maybe, to save himself from a lifetime of wondering what might have been. So, he said, still holding her hand, what's our next move? Princess Zarakai's features shifted into what Marcus was learning to recognize as her planning expression, intense concentration with a hint of anticipation. Tomorrow, we begin reaching out to representatives from the conquered worlds. If we are going to propose a new model for imperial expansion, we will need their cooperation. That's going to be tricky. They're not exactly likely to trust communications from imperial channels. No, she agreed. But, they might trust communications from the human who challenged the princess of the empire and lived to tell about it. Marcus felt a chill of apprehension. You want me to contact resistance leaders? I want you to contact the shadow network you identified. The economic partnerships, the trade relationships, the informal alliances. Princess Zarakai squeezed his hand gently. If we can convince them that we're serious about changing the imperial system, they could become our most powerful allies. And, if we can't convince them? Then, they could become our most dangerous enemies. Her black eyes met his steadily. But that is a risk we must take if we want to create something better than what currently exists. Marcus nodded slowly. All right. But I'm going to need more than just economic data to convince them. I'm going to need proof that you're serious about change. What kind of proof? Marcus thought about it for a moment, considering what would convince him if their positions were reversed. Start with something small but symbolic. Something that shows you're willing to challenge imperial protocol for the sake of doing what's right. Such as making our marriage ceremony about partnership instead of conquest. Marcus met her gaze. Instead of forcing me to submit to imperial authority, what if we made it about two equals choosing to work together? Princess Zarakai's grip on his hand tightened slightly. The Imperial Council would never approve such changes to the traditional ceremony. Then, don't ask for their approval. Just do it. Marcus smiled. Sometimes revolution starts with refusing to ask permission. For a moment, Princess Zarakai looked almost frightened by the implications of what he was suggesting. Then, her features shifted into something that looked remarkably like determination. Very well, she said. If we are going to change the empire, we might as well start with changing how it sees us. As they stood together in the crystal chamber, planning what might be either the salvation or destruction of both their civilizations, Marcus found himself thinking that this was definitely not how he'd expected his first marriage proposal to go. But, then, again, nothing about this situation had gone according to anyone's expectations. And, maybe that was exactly what made it worth trying. The fourth day began with chaos. Marcus was awakened by the sound of his quarters door chiming insistently, followed by the entrance of Scholar Prime Cathera looking more agitated than he'd ever seen her. Behind her came two guards who looked as though they'd prefer to be anywhere else in the galaxy. Human Marcus, Cathera said without preamble, the princess requires your immediate presence in the war room. Marcus sat up in the alien bed, noting the tension in the Scholar Prime's voice. War room? That doesn't sound like our usual morning briefing. The Imperial Council has learned of your conversations with the princess. They have demanded an emergency session to review the arrangements for tomorrow's ceremony. Cathera's black eyes held an intensity that made Marcus's stomach clench. There is concern that Imperial protocol may be compromised. Marcus was on his feet and reaching for clothes before she finished speaking. How much trouble is she in? Unknown. The council speaks in closed session, and the princess has been summoned to provide explanations for her recent decisions. Cathera gestured toward the guards. You are to be prepared for immediate transport to the imperial capital if required. Transport to Marcus paused in the middle of pulling on his shirt. We're not at the capital? The Crimson Dominion has been en route to Veltar Prime since your capture. We arrived today, several hours ahead of schedule. Cathera's voice carried undertones that Marcus couldn't identify. The acceleration was ordered by the Imperial Council after they received reports of unusual activity aboard this vessel. Marcus finished dressing quickly, his mind racing through the implications. If the Imperial Council was suspicious enough to change their arrival schedule, it meant someone had been monitoring his conversations with the princess more closely than either of them had realized. And, if they were being summoned to the capital ahead of schedule, it meant the political situation was deteriorating rapidly. Cathera, he said as they moved through the ship's corridors, what exactly did the princess tell the council about our discussions? Nothing, the Scholar Prime replied. That is precisely the problem. The war room was unlike any space Marcus had seen aboard the Crimson Dominion. Where the other chambers emphasized artistry and flowing lines, this space was purely functional banks of holographic displays showing real-time data from across the Empire, communication arrays connecting to dozens of different star systems, and tactical planning surfaces that could apparently model any conceivable military scenario. Princess Zarakai stood at the center of it all, but she wasn't alone. 3 other Veltar were present, each wearing formal robes that indicated high rank within the imperial hierarchy. Marcus didn't need introductions to know he was looking at members of the Imperial Council. Marcus, Princess Zarakai said as he entered, her voice carefully formal. Allow me to present Council Prime Thekvor, Admiral Shandai, and Economic Minister Velthara. The three council members studied Marcus with the kind of intense scrutiny usually reserved for potentially dangerous specimens. Council Prime Thekvor, apparently the senior member, stepped forward with movements that suggested barely contained hostility. "Human," he said, his English heavily accented but clear. "You have been granted extraordinary access to imperial resources and personnel. We require an explanation for your activities." Marcus glanced at Princess Zarakai, noting the careful blankness of her expression. Whatever was happening here, she was giving him no clues about how to handle it. "My activities have consisted primarily of learning about Veltar culture and preparing for tomorrow's ceremony, Council Prime." "You have been reviewing classified economic and military data," Admiral Shindai interjected. "Information far beyond what is required for ceremonial preparation. The princess felt that understanding the Empire would help me fulfill my role more effectively," Marcus replied, keeping his voice level despite the growing tension in the room. "I've been honored by her willingness to share such knowledge." Economic Minister Velthara moved closer, her black eyes reflecting the light from the holographic displays. "And what conclusions have you drawn from this knowledge, human?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to spring. Marcus could feel the weight of attention from everyone in the room, not just the council members, but Princess Zarakai and even the guards positioned near the chamber's exits. His next words could determine not only his own fate, but the future of everything he and the princess had discussed over the past 3 days. "I've concluded that the Empire is far more complex and sophisticated than Earth's intelligence reports suggested," he said carefully. "The level of coordination required to manage so many different civilizations is impressive." "That is not an answer," Council Prime Thekvor said coldly. "Your access to imperial data has been unprecedented for a marriage consort. Princess Zarakai has justified this by claiming you are providing valuable insights into human psychology and culture." "What insights have you provided?" Marcus felt sweat beginning to form despite the chamber's cool temperature. He could give them the safe answer, claim that his observations were limited to human cultural patterns and avoid any mention of his broader analyses. Or he could take a calculated risk and see if there was any support among the council for the changes he and the princess had discussed. "Council Prime," he said, making his decision, "the most important insight I can offer is that humanity will not integrate into the Empire the same way previous conquered species have." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus could see Princess Zarakai's features tighten almost imperceptibly, but she remained silent. "Explain," Admiral Shindai commanded. "Humans have a cultural tendency toward independence and innovation that makes traditional conquest and submission models ineffective." Marcus gestured toward the holographic displays around them. "The preliminary economic data from Earth's colonies already shows patterns similar to those seen in other recently conquered worlds: increased productivity coupled with decreased compliance with imperial resource allocation quotas." Economic Minister Velthara's head tilted in the distinctly Veltar expression of interest. "You have observed these patterns in other conquered worlds?" Marcus glanced at Princess Zarakai, who gave him the slightest of nods. "Yes, Minister. The data suggests that recent conquests have been developing independent economic networks that operate parallel to official imperial systems. These networks appear to be most developed among species that share certain cultural characteristics with humanity." "What characteristics?" Council Prime Thekvor's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Innovation-based economies, decentralized political structures, and cultural values that emphasize individual achievement within group cooperation." Marcus took a deep breath. "In other words, species that are naturally inclined toward the kind of thinking that drives economic and technological advancement." The three council members exchanged glances that Marcus couldn't interpret, but he could sense a shift in the room's atmosphere. Economic Minister Velthara moved to one of the holographic displays and began calling up data sets that looked familiar to Marcus, the same economic analyses he'd reviewed with the princess. "These patterns you mention," she said, studying the displays, "how would you suggest the Empire respond to them?" Another trap, but this one felt different. Marcus had the sense that Velthara was genuinely interested in his answer rather than simply looking for evidence of sedition. The Empire could choose to see them as threats to be suppressed, or as opportunities to be developed. "Opportunities?" Admiral Shendai's voice suggested skepticism. Minister Velthara can show you the resource allocation data, Admiral. Suppressing these independent networks requires significant military and administrative resources. But, if the Empire could find ways to formalize and regulate them instead of suppressing them. Marcus gestured toward the economic displays. The potential benefits could far exceed the costs of traditional occupation methods. Economic Minister Velthara nodded slowly, her attention focused on the holographic data. The preliminary economic models do suggest significant efficiencies could be gained through partnership-based integration rather than conquest-based subjugation. You speak of partnership with conquered enemies, Council Prime Thekvor said coldly. Such concepts are antithetical to imperial doctrine. With respect, Council Prime, Marcus replied, imperial doctrine was developed for expansion scenarios that may no longer be representative of current conditions. He gestured toward the displays showing military deployment across the Empire. How many fleets are currently assigned to suppression operations rather than exploration? Admiral Shindai's features tightened. Military deployment is classified, the ratio is approximately 60-40, Princess Zarakai said quietly, speaking for the first time since the introductions. 60% of our military resources are dedicated to maintaining control over conquered territories. 40% are available for expansion operations. The admission sent a visible shock through the council members. Council Prime Thekvor turned to face the princess with barely contained fury. Those figures are not to be discussed with outsiders, princess. Marcus is not an outsider, Princess Zarakai replied, her voice carrying the authority of her royal status. He is my consort and partner. If we are to successfully integrate his species into the Empire, he must understand both the challenges and opportunities we face. Your consort and partner? Economic Minister Velthara's voice carried surprise. The marriage ceremony is tomorrow. Until that time, he remains a conquered representative. Princess Zarakai moved to stand beside Marcus, a gesture that was clearly visible to everyone in the room. The ceremonial formalities are less important than the practical realities. Marcus and I have spent the past 3 days developing a working relationship based on mutual respect and shared goals. I see no reason to pretend otherwise. Marcus felt a flutter of something that might have been panic. Princess Zarakai was openly challenging the council's authority in defense of their partnership, which was either very brave or very reckless. Probably both. Shared goals? Council Prime Thekvor's voice was dangerously quiet. Princess, your goal is to represent the Empire's interests. What goals could you possibly share with a representative of a conquered species? The goal of ensuring the Empire's long-term prosperity and stability, Princess Zarakai replied without hesitation. Which requires adapting our expansion methods to current realities rather than clinging to traditional approaches that are proving increasingly ineffective. The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the distant hum of the ship's engines through the chamber's walls. The 3 council members stood motionless, their alien features cycling through expressions that suggested intense internal deliberation. Finally, Economic Minister Velthara spoke. Princess, you are suggesting fundamental changes to imperial policy based on the recommendations of a single conquest representative. Such changes would require extensive analysis and approval from the full council. I am suggesting that we begin such analysis immediately, Princess Zarakai replied. And, I am requesting that Marcus be granted full partner status to assist in that analysis. Partner status? Admiral Shendai's voice suggested disbelief. For a conquered human? For the individual who has identified patterns that our own analysts missed, Princess Zarakai said firmly. For the person who may hold the key to transforming the Empire's expansion from a series of costly military operations into a sustainable program of mutual development. Marcus found himself holding his breath as the 3 council members exchanged more glances. The next few seconds would determine not only his own fate, but the future of the partnership he and Princess Zarakai had begun building. Council Prime Thekvor stepped forward, his black eyes fixed on Marcus with laser intensity. Human Marcus Chen, he said formally, you claim that your species and others like it require different integration methods than traditional conquest protocols. Yes, Council Prime. You believe that partnership-based approaches would be more effective than submission-based approaches. I do. And, you are willing to stake your life on these beliefs? Marcus glanced at Princess Zarakai, who met his gaze with steady confidence. I'm willing to stake my life on the possibility of creating something better than what currently exists, he said. Council Prime Thekvor was silent for a long moment, then turned to face Princess Zarakai. Very well, Princess. You will have your opportunity to test these theories. The Council grants provisional approval for alternative ceremony protocols. Marcus felt his knees nearly buckle with relief, but Thekvor continued before anyone could react. However, these alternatives must demonstrate clear benefits to the Empire within one standard year. If partnership-based integration proves less effective than traditional methods, both you and your consort will answer for the consequences. Understood, Council Prime, Princess Zarakai replied. And, the marriage ceremony tomorrow will be broadcast throughout the Empire as usual. Whatever alternative protocols you implement must serve imperial interests, not human ones. Of course. As the council members filed out of the war room, Marcus realized he was trembling slightly. They had won not everything they wanted, but a chance to prove their ideas could work. Now came the truly difficult part, making sure those ideas actually succeeded. Zarakai, he said quietly, please tell me you have a plan for tomorrow's ceremony. Princess Zarakai turned to face him, and Marcus saw something in her alien features that he hadn't expected, determination mixed with what might have been excitement. I have a plan, she said. But, I think you are going to find it quite surprising. The imperial capital of Veltar Prime was unlike anything Marcus had ever imagined. As the Crimson Dominion approached the massive space dock, he could see the planet below, a world that appeared to be entirely covered in crystalline structures that caught and reflected the light from 3 different suns. Cities rose like living coral reefs from the surface, connected by streams of light that Marcus realized were transportation systems moving at speeds that defied physics as he understood it. It's beautiful, he said, standing beside Princess Zarakai in the observation deck of her private quarters. It is the heart of an empire that spans 47 star systems, she replied, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. After tomorrow, it will either be the heart of something greater, or the center of a civil war that tears apart everything my ancestors built. Marcus turned from the viewing port to study her profile. In the light from Veltar Prime's 3 suns, the silver patterns in her skin seemed to glow, and her alien beauty struck him with renewed force. Over the past week, he had grown accustomed to her appearance, but seeing her here in the context of her home world reminded him of just how far from Earth and from anything resembling normal his life had traveled. Are you having second thoughts? He asked gently. I am having many thoughts, Princess Zarakai admitted. About tomorrow, about the Empire, about. She paused, her black eyes meeting his. About us. What about us? She was quiet for a long moment, her attention apparently focused on the approaching space dock. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. In all my planning for how to change the Empire, I did not anticipate how much I would change myself. Marcus moved closer to her, close enough to see the subtle patterns that traced across her features. How have you changed? A week ago, I saw marriage as a political necessity, a tool for demonstrating imperial power over conquered species. I never considered that it might be. She gestured helplessly. I do not have words in either of our languages for what I have discovered. Try anyway. Princess Zarakai turned to face him fully, her alien features open in a way that made her seem suddenly vulnerable. I have discovered that having someone who sees me as simply Zarakai, rather than as the princess of the Empire, is liberating. And terrifying. And wonderful. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the chamber's environmental systems. I've discovered something similar. A week ago, you were the enemy princess who might kill me for entertainment. Now. He reached out to touch one of the silver patterns that traced along her cheek. Now you're the woman I'm planning to marry, and I find myself hoping it works out. Even knowing that it might destroy both our civilizations? Especially knowing that. Marcus smiled. Because if it works, we might create something neither of our civilizations could achieve alone. Princess Zarakai leaned into his touch, a gesture that seemed more human than Veltar. The ceremony begins in 6 hours. Are you ready? No, she said simply. But, I am willing to try. The grand amphitheater of Veltar Prime could hold 2 million beings, and every seat was filled. Marcus stood on a platform suspended in the center of the vast space, wearing formal robes that had been specifically designed to blend Veltar and human aesthetic sensibilities. Around him, holographic displays broadcast the ceremony to every world in the Empire, billions of beings watching to see how the latest conquest would be formally integrated into imperial authority. What they were about to see would be unlike any previous imperial marriage ceremony. Princess Zarakai approached across a bridge of crystallized light, wearing robes that seemed to be woven from starlight itself. She moved with the fluid grace he had come to associate with her, but her expression was serious, almost solemn. This was not just a wedding, it was a political statement that would redefine the Empire's relationship with every conquered world. As she reached the platform, the traditional Veltar marriage officiant, an ancient being whose robes suggested centuries of service to the imperial family, began the ceremonial recitations. Marcus understood perhaps one word in 10, but he had been briefed on the ceremony's structure. The traditional format called for him to formally submit to imperial authority, to renounce his allegiance to humanity, and to accept his new role as a symbol of his species' integration into the Empire. He was going to do none of those things. When the officiant turned to him for the traditional response, Marcus stepped forward and began speaking in English, knowing that translation systems throughout the amphitheater would carry his words to every corner of the Empire. I am Marcus Chen of Earth, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the vast space. I stand here not as a conquered representative, but as a partner in building something new. I offer my knowledge, my skills, and my commitment to working with Princess Zarakai and the Veltar people to create an empire based on cooperation rather than conquest. A murmur ran through the massive audience, clearly this was not what they had expected to hear. But, Marcus continued, following the script he and Princess Zarakai had developed during their planning sessions. I do not submit to imperial authority. Instead, I choose to join my efforts with those of the Empire to build a future where different species work together as equals, where expansion happens through invitation rather than invasion, and where strength comes from unity rather than domination. The murmur grew louder, but Princess Zarakai stepped forward before it could become something more disruptive. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of her royal status and the passion of her personal convictions. I am Zarakai, Princess of the Veltar Empire, heir to 47 star systems and 3 centuries of expansion. Her words echoed through the amphitheater with crystal clarity. And I accept Marcus Chen not as a conquered subject, but as an equal partner in building an empire worthy of all the species it encompasses. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus could see shock and confusion on the alien faces visible in the nearest sections of seating. This was not just a deviation from traditional ceremony, it was a fundamental challenge to the philosophical foundations of imperial expansion. Princess Zarakai continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. For too long, we have seen expansion as a process of conquest and submission. But our newest allies, the humans, the Andromedans, the Caraxians, and many others, have shown us that there is a better way. They have demonstrated that partnership creates more wealth, more innovation, and more strength than submission ever could. She gestured toward the holographic displays surrounding the platform, which began showing the economic data that Marcus had helped her analyze. The evidence is clear in our own records. Worlds that have developed as partners rather than subjects have contributed more to the Empire than any conquered territories in our history. Therefore, she said, her voice rising to carry across the entire amphitheater, I announced the beginning of a new era for the Veltar Empire. An era in which expansion happens through invitation and alliance rather than conquest and domination. An era in which different species work together as equals to build something greater than any of us could achieve alone. The amphitheater erupted. Marcus could see beings throughout the massive space rising to their feet, some in apparent celebration, others in obvious outrage. The holographic displays flickered as communication systems throughout the Empire overloaded with responses from worlds across 47 star systems. In the reserved sections where Marcus assumed the noble families and senior officials sat, he could see heated discussions that looked on the verge of becoming physical confrontations. But Princess Zarakai wasn't finished. To demonstrate our commitment to this new approach, she said, her voice somehow cutting through the chaos, I call upon representatives from the Andromedan Confederacy, the Caraxian Syndicate, and 12 other allied worlds to join us in forming the Empire's first Integrated Development Council. The massive displays around the amphitheater suddenly showed dozens of different beings, representatives from across the Empire who had apparently been secretly coordinated for this moment. Marcus recognized some of the faces from the economic data they had reviewed, leaders of the independent trade networks that had been developing parallel to the official imperial systems. These representatives will work with imperial administrators to develop new models for expansion and integration, Princess Zarakai announced.